I really want to start out with a huge thank you to you guys for being here tonight. We've never done anything like this public participation workshop before, and we're really excited about it. We're really excited that you're here, and we hope that it's useful for you, that you get something out of it. We expect that we'll hear some really good suggestions and ideas from you as well about process and how to make things more accessible for you to participate in the process too. So thank you for being here. I want to start probably with introductions of who we are. So I'm Tricia Oath. I do work at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. It's really long, and then I work with the Air Quality Control Commission.
Can you hear me?
I'm Jeremy Newsender, and I work under Tricia as a policy advisor to the Environmental Boards and Commissions. So I work with the Air Commission and the Water Quality Control Commission primarily.
And my name is Sean Hackett. I'm the energy liaison with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We'll try to not use too many acronyms today, but CDPHE is one acronym that we'll be using a lot. I'm our liaison to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, COG.
Good. So I wanted to also kind of get a sense of who you all are, if we can do that. Do you want me to adjust this in any way? Or is we're just working out some tweaks?
Just working out some tweaks.
Okay, cool, thanks. I wanted to get a sense of who we have here in the audience. And I don't know the best way necessarily to do this, but maybe let's try by county. So how many of you here are from Broomfield? Okay, good amount. Great, so maybe we picked a good spot. How about Weld County? Okay, some. Larimer? Okay. Boulder? Okay. Adams? Okay. Arapahoe? Okay. Any others? Am I missing anyone?
Yep.
Thank you. Denver, yes. Jefferson? Okay. Others? Okay. Pretty good mix. Okay, thanks. Couple housekeeping things. If you haven't found it already, the restrooms are just out this door to the left and down the hallway. There are some water fountains out there also if you have a water bottle. We do have a sign-in sheet just outside the door. I'd encourage you to sign in if you haven't, mostly to provide your email address, because that's a way that we'll be able to share with you. We're recording tonight, so we'll be able to send you the information about where to find that video, and also send you these slides in case there's some information on them that you might find useful or might want to pass along to other people, and that way we can reach you that way, and we can also make sure that you get notices of these hearings that are coming up. I want to say a huge thank you to City and County of Broomfield for hosting us here tonight, and in particular Laura Davis and Tim Yelico. Thank you very much for all of your help. We're happy to be here. This is a really nice venue, although I'm always a little uncomfortable on stage, but so be it. I also want to thank both Sean and Jeremy for helping putting together and organizing this, so thank you both very much. When we get to questions, I'm going to run through a presentation. I welcome questions throughout. I just want this to be a little more conversational. I think with the crowd that we have, that should be doable. Because we're recording it, we'll ask that you use these mics up front during, if you have questions during the presentation. If not, I can try to just repeat the question. But then at the end of the session, when we get to Q&A, do line up at these mics, so that we can capture all of your questions on the recording as well. Let's see. In case you or others are interested, we are going to do this again on the West Slope and Grand Junction on September 10th. So wanted to pass that along. And then one last housekeeping piece would be, we scheduled this until 8 o'clock, just for security reasons and respect for the space. I think we're going to try to wrap things up at 7:50. Just so we can get folks out of here and be respectful to Broomfield. So hopefully that will be okay with everyone. Let's see, I think with that, go forward. So again, I just want to say, we've not done this before, but public input is really important to dealing with these issues. I've been working with environmental boards and commissions for 15 years, and I firmly believe that the best decisions are made when we've got all of the voices represented at the table, and when the commission is able to hear meaningful input from all kinds of perspectives and experiences. And so we wanted to do this so that those who maybe haven't participated in commission proceedings as much can have some ability to a better understanding of who the commission is, how their processes work, and how you can best engage. And so those are our goals. We hope that we can help you with that. If you have other goals, let's talk about those as well. We really understand that the process can be confusing, and so we're really just trying to help you navigate that so that you know how to plug in. You're not frustrated by going to the wrong place or anything like that, and also so that the commission can hear your comments and really take them into consideration, because that's extremely important for them. And so I plan to focus tonight really on just process, about what does it mean to participate in a rulemaking hearing? Who is the Air Quality Control Commission? What do they do? How did they get there? We're not going to get into the substance of what the decisions are going to be considered this fall. I'm not the decision maker. Excuse me. I work for the commission, but I'm not a commissioner, and I don't make those decisions. So while I'm definitely interested in your ideas, what I'm really hoping to do tonight is how to help you most easily provide your comments to those decision makers. Quick overview of what's in store for tonight, which I think will maybe take about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how many questions there are in the meantime. But we'll get through an overview of who the Air Quality Control Commission is, an overview of those proposed revisions that are going to be considered in the December rulemaking hearing, walk through what the process looks like. I'd like to spend a lot of time with that just so that it becomes more familiar for anybody who hasn't participated. Provide some tips just from my experience of seeing what works with commissions and in these processes. And then touch some on the additional elements of things having to do with oil and gas regulation that will be considered in other rulemaking hearings, just to try to start helping folks understand, if you're concerned about XYZ issue, is that going to be part of the December hearing with the Air Quality Control Commission, or is that going to be dealt with elsewhere? So for that, we'll do additional elements of Senate Bill 181 to be considered in other hearings, and then also touch on the overview of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and their upcoming rulemakings. We understand it can be confusing, I think, sometimes to understand which of the commissions is doing what, so we want to try to help provide some clarity there, and then end with just important dates. So the AQCC, sorry for the acronym, but stands for Air Quality Control Commission. So who they are is this is a volunteer citizen group. There's 9 people who sit on the Air Quality Control Commission. They are experts in different areas of air quality. We've got someone who's a public health director, a lung doctor, an environmental engineer, and a lot of other different backgrounds and perspectives. They are there, they're volunteering their time to try to do what's right for Colorado. They are really concerned also about air quality in Colorado and public health protection, and so that's why they've dedicated their time to it. There's a pretty good geographical diversity represented on the commission, so about half of them are from outside of the metro area. One is from Craig, Durango, Basalt, and Fort Collins. So trying to, the pretty good representation of some different perspectives from around the state. Each of them, they are appointed by the governor and then confirmed by the Senate, and they serve for 3 years at a time. So each year, two or three of them are finishing their term and are either reappointed or a new person is appointed. So it's possible, I don't know all of you, certainly, so some of you may have been commissioners in the past, and some of you may be commissioners in the future. They're really just composed of citizens who are appointed by the governor. So in case there are folks who don't know about this, I wanted to talk some about how the Air Quality Control Commission gets the authority to do what they do. So, we'll be talking about how they're having this rulemaking hearing in December. Well, the reason that they have the authority to do what they do comes from statute and comes from the legislature. So the Colorado legislature adopts by statute and establishes the scope of the authority that the commission has, and so that, that it could be expansive or it could be narrow, but the commission can only do what the legislature has empowered them to do. And so once the statute passes, like Senate Bill 181, which some of you are likely familiar with, then the commission then has to go through this whole rulemaking process to adopt rules to implement that statutory directive. So so what happened at the legislature isn't automatically a rule yet. So it's a law, but then the commission has to go through this rulemaking process to put some more meat on the bones, so to speak. Let's see. Again, just kind of trying to explain that the scope of their authority is really defined by statute. So, for example, the commission doesn't have the authority to ban oil and gas activity, but they have the authority to require controls to minimize emissions. Their authority is related to things having to do with regulating air pollution, but it's not about siting or land use control. That's local jurisdiction authority. If you do some research and you're poking around and you see Air Quality Control Commission regulations, you'll see that there are a lot of them. There are 21 control regulations dealing with all kinds of air pollution issues throughout the state and all kinds of different sources. But if we're talking about oil and gas, there's probably 3 that are really key for you to know about. One is the procedural rules. So if you're going to participate in this hearing, it's helpful to take a look at the procedural rules, or even if you're just interested in knowing a little bit more, getting a better understanding of how the process works. A lot of the steps of how the hearing works are all laid out in the procedural rules so that it's transparent process and it's fair for everybody to know what to expect. And then there are two regulations that are more substantively dealing with what are the regulations that apply to the oil and gas sector, and that's regulations 3 and 7. And so both of those will be, their changes to those will be considered in this December rulemaking hearing. So they already include some controls and some requirements for the oil and gas sector, but we'll be looking at some modifications to those. So what is required to propose a rule? Typically, it is the commission's staff at the Air Pollution Control Division who proposes a rule. And that's likely to be the case in this case as well. So when the division is going to propose a rule, in addition to having to have number 5, the draft regulatory language, they also have to do an initial and a final economic impact analysis. So evaluating, the controls that they are proposing to do, what economic impact will that have, as well as we would expect that a cost-benefit analysis and a regulatory analysis will both be requested. So they're likely to prepare those, which will talk about both the costs and also the benefits of what is being proposed. These requirements apply to the division as the proponent of the rule. They also apply to any party who proposes an alternative rule. Most parties do not do that. It typically is just the division, but if that is the case, then these requirements also apply to that party. Okay, so this slide and the next slide, I wanted to go through and not to talk in detail about what exactly leak detection and repair requirements are going to be considered, but to start trying to help get some clarity on what are the substantive areas that are going to be part of the scope of the hearing in December, and what might be in other hearings, so we can focus. So December we'll be considering some changes to the leak detection and repair rules. There's already a program in place, but we'll be looking at an expansion. Some rules dealing with the transmission sector, pneumatic devices, storage tanks, new truck loadout requirements. This is not as easy, more words here, but looking at well unloading. The second one I think is an important one to highlight also. So this would be a proposal to remove the existing provision that allows operators of new oil and gas exploration and production facilities up to 90 days to apply for a permit. So the proposal will be to do away with that exemption. We'll also be looking at some really new and novel methane reporting rules. Okay, so the rulemaking hearing process, in case any of you are not familiar with it, we know it can be confusing and cumbersome, and it's evolved to this way over the years, and I really truly believe that for better or worse, in most cases, this is a really good process. It allows for people to participate at a level that makes sense for them, given their level of interest in the issue. And it also makes sure that the commissioners, who at the end of the day have to make a decision about what's the right policy call on these rules, that they have all of the information that they need to make a really informed decision. So that's the goal. So I hope it doesn't seem like overkill, but that's the purpose behind it. So the stage that we're in right now is the first bullet. The Air Pollution Control Division is engaging in an informal stakeholder process. So they've been holding meetings, a couple of meetings over the last couple of months, and they have at least one more coming up in Grand Junction. And they're soliciting comments in writing as well, where they've shared out what they are proposing to the commission in terms of those areas I highlighted on the last couple of slides. So that's the part we're in right now. But step 2 is sort of when we consider it's when it moves into the quote unquote more formal rulemaking hearing process, and that's really when the commission's hearing process begins. So that first step will happen on December 19th, and that's when the division will request that the commission set a rulemaking hearing. At that time, they have to include not only the regulatory language, but also that initial economic impact analysis, and all of that is available for the public to see. I want to note that on that date, on the 19th, the commission will accept public comment at that time, so if anyone is interested in doing that, that is definitely an opportunity. I would say that there's not a lot of decision making that is happening at that point. Really, the only decision that is before the commission at that point is, do they want to set the rule for hearing? Do they want to set a rulemaking hearing or not? And they almost always do. I don't know if there's an example of any time that they have said no. But so I would fully expect that they will grant that request and that a hearing would be set. So if you're feeling like, because I know this can take a lot of time and effort, if you're feeling like you want to focus your efforts, that's one where you would maybe wait so that your comments are included on the rulemaking hearing record. Because anything that is submitted as part of this request, it's helpful, but it's not technically part of the rulemaking hearing record that can influence their decision in December. So I just wanted to share that. Let's see. So once we go through the request for hearing, and assuming the commission grants that request and it gets set for hearing, then the first step is that party status requests will be due. I'll talk in another slide or two about what it means to request party status. So I'm going to maybe just hold off on that for a second. For those who do request party status, then a number of these other bullets would apply. There's a status conference held with the hearing officer, and that's mandatory for all of the parties to attend. And the idea is really just to start understanding what are the issues that are going to be addressed in the hearing, deal with some procedural elements, address who does have party status and things like that. And then there's a pre-hearing statement deadline, which is going to be November 5th. And so this is the deadline by which both the division as the proponent and anybody who is a party to the hearing submits a pre-hearing statement that outlines their position about the division's proposal. So sometimes folks parties will submit a pre-hearing statement that is supportive of the proposal, supportive in part, opposed, or likes it but offering some tweaks to the rule or some other suggestions to the rule, maybe provide some additional evidence for or against the rule. That all comes in the pre-hearing statement deadline. A few weeks after that, there's the pre-hearing conference. Again, this is mandatory for all of the parties to attend. And that, again, is with the hearing officer, and it's to really hone in a little bit more on what are the outstanding issues in the rulemaking hearing, and also deal with some procedural elements about how the oral testimony at the hearing is going to occur. After that, there is a second opportunity for submitting information in writing, and so that's the rebuttal statement. And so after pre-hearing statements are submitted, parties will typically read everyone else's pre-hearing statement that was submitted, and they'll submit a rebuttal statement. So if they have a response to what someone else has argued or provided, that's their opportunity to submit that onto the record so that the commission can hear sort of some of the back and forth about, well, we heard this argument, but we have this perspective, or there's also this data, or this information. Then we get to, if requested, that's when the cost-benefit analysis and regulatory analysis would be submitted by the division. And then separately, this bullet that's in bold here, this is for those who are not parties to the rulemaking hearing. And this is why I was talking about how there's a way for people to participate at different levels. So what I just went through is if you want to participate as a party to the rulemaking hearing, but if that's participating at a level that's not where you want to be, there's also an opportunity to provide public comment. So you can provide public comment both in writing, but also we're going to have 3 oral public comment sessions throughout the state. So we're going to have one in Rifle on the 10th, one in Durango on the 11th, and one in Loveland on the 16th. We won't be having additional public comment in Denver, so when we go back to Denver for the party testimony on December 17th, we'll have already concluded public comment at that time. So if you're interested in doing public comment, you'd want to provide it in one of those 3 settings or in written public comment. We're asking that written public comment be submitted by November 26th. And the reason for that is because we are expecting a lot of public comment for this hearing. And the sooner that we can get it in, then that means the sooner it's available for commissioners to be able to review it ahead of time and take it into consideration. And then, as I said, we'll have oral testimony by the parties starting on December 17th. And then we would expect that the commission will make their deliberations and vote on December 19th. Okay, so there are the 2 pathways. If you're interested in providing comment to the commission, there's 2 ways to do so, either through general public comment or by being a party. I think public comments are extremely powerful. I have seen them. I've seen commissioners really remark on being persuaded by something that they read in public comment, and I think they really take them seriously. That said, from my perspective, what I have seen is that there are times when folks are encouraged to sign on to submit a form letter, and I think that's great. In my experience, I think people can maybe have the misunderstanding that in a way that this is kind of like a vote, that if the commission receives 1,000 of these form letters, that's going to weight things differently. And I just think that the way that the commissioners are making decisions is they're basing it on sound reasoning and scientific evidence and compelling stories and information. And so I think there are times when one really thoughtful public comment letter can be more powerful than a lot of form letters signed on. So I just wanted to share that from my experience. And I think personalized letters are really, truly the most effective I know they're time consuming, but it's, it takes more thought than signing on to something, but I think they're really important. And so if you're interested in doing that, I think the way to make it the most effective is really to take a good look at the proposed rule. Make sure that what you'd like to ask the commission to do is something that they have the authority to do. Start out, this is a simple suggestion, but it helps. Start out with a really clear statement of what it is that you want the commission to do or not to do. Be as specific as possible. It's more helpful to say, I think that the monitoring requirements should be X, Y, Z, then I think you should make things as stringent as possible, for example. Excuse me. Again, just be as clear and concise as possible. I think you keep in mind that we're expecting that the commissioners will get hundreds or maybe thousands of public comments, and the more that we can sort of condense them and be concise, the more they'll be able to give them all really meaningful consideration. One more note. I would say also we've seen a lot of public comments where folks really are wanting to contextualize the concern about air quality and ozone issues, and that's absolutely true. I think that, I just want to share, commissioners are really acutely aware of that. So I would focus your time and attention and penmanship, not on that, but more about, really what you want, what kind of action you want them to take or not to take, or specifically sharing a story of yours about why you care enough to spend your time here tonight and why you care enough to submit a comment to them. Let's see. Okay, and then so that's one pathway. And then if you were to choose the other pathway of being a party to the hearing, just want to reiterate again, it just means attendance at that status conference and pre-hearing conference is required, and that you would be submitting a pre-hearing statement and likely a rebuttal statement. So it's just a more formal and more elevated level of participation than providing public comment. I did want to suggest, that from what I have seen, coalitions of people, of citizens, of groups, of those who have similar interests and perspectives, that's really effective with the commission. I know that maybe there are some mixed feelings about that, and does it result in fairness? And I really think that it does. I think for the Air Quality Control Commission, they really value people who are taking the time to try to talk with one another and consolidate like-minded viewpoints and considerations. I think that's important to them. Maybe one example to share was in a recent rulemaking hearing about electric vehicle standards. So it has nothing to do with oil and gas, but we had a number of coalitions come in for like the auto manufacturers, for example, and then there was one auto manufacturer who decided to have party status individually. And when it came to allocations of time at the hearing, the coalitions, were allocated I think about an hour of oral testimony time, and the individual manufacturer who had requested like 3 hours, I think ended up with about 15 minutes. So I think the commission tries to really weight the coalitions and be fair about the amount of time that they have in order to present their case. Yeah, and it's definitely not prohibited, but it is pretty unusual for individual citizens to be a party to the hearing, so don't feel any pressure. If you would like to do that, it's absolutely an avenue available to you, but don't feel like that's the only way to participate in a meaningful way. Okay, so as promised, I do want to share just a couple of other rulemaking hearings that are going to be coming up that could touch on oil and gas. So if the scope of this hearing in December is something that's not your issue, but you might be interested in some other issues, you might want to keep your eye out for these hearings. So there will be a hearing in March of 2020 regarding engines. in May of 2020 regarding greenhouse gas inventory requirements and reporting requirements. Next November, another regional haze hearing will occur, and then we'll also be doing, and we don't know the exact month yet, but next fall, the second round of rulemaking hearings in response to the directives in Senate Bill 181. And we have yet to determine when we'll have the rulemaking hearing to address the requirements from the bump up to serious ozone non-attainment. And now I'm going to ask Sean if you would mind taking over and talking about the next two slides about the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission.
Thank you, Tricia. And yeah, just wanted to provide a brief high-level overview about the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the COGCC, to hopefully help folks in the room get an understanding of where our commissions differ. As many of you know, oil and gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing in the state of Colorado is regulated primarily through the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Act, with rules and regulations promulgated by COGCC. Similar to CDPHE's programs, COGCC is comprised of professional staff and a commission of 9 volunteer citizens who are charged with implementing their mission as revised by Senate Bill 181, and I have their new revised mission up on the slide there. That new mission is to regulate the development of oil and gas in the state of Colorado in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. Now, real quick on the staff, they consist of highly qualified professionals, engineers, hydrologists, environmental protection specialists, legal and policy professionals, and administrative support staff. They've also hired on, I think, their first ever communications person for that to help spread the word about the work that they're doing. And by statute, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Act lays out the qualification of the 9 volunteer commissioners. In the statute, the commission's required to consist of both the executive directors of the Department of Natural Resources and the executive director of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or whoever they designate to fill that role. And also, the remaining commissioners have to have substantial experience in the oil and gas industry, planning and land use, environmental protection, wildlife protection, or reclamation, public health, and kind of a catch-all category is a person who will contribute to the body of expertise that will aid the commission in making sound, balanced decisions. So COGCC's commission adopts regulations, sets policy, and conducts hearings, and staff implements those policies on a daily basis, and they're generally in charge of most of the permitting decisions that are made. So in general, and there are some kind of exceptions and maybe some caveats to this, but COGCC has primary authority over the underground or downhole impacts of oil and gas drilling, and they have authority over the pre-production phases of oil and gas development. And given their broad authority over drilling, hydraulic fracturing, completions, the pre-production phase, currently the CDPHE, the Air Quality Control Commission's authority over those pre-production phases is somewhat narrow in scope. And once the well's in production, the Air Quality Control Commission, or CDPHE more broadly, regulates the above ground impacts to air, water, and waste management. And as some of you in the room may know, Senate Bill 181 clarified the authority of the Air Quality Control Commission to regulate those pre-production emissions during drilling and completions. However, as Tricia just went through there, any changes that would occur during that phase of development would require a formal notice and public comment and rulemaking process. COGCC, it's important to note, they do have some rules in place regarding air quality and the protection of air quality. In particular, they have their 800 series rules that concern odors. Within that, they have a Rule 805 that requires oil and gas operators to implement green completion practices or reduced emission completions. And then also, so they do have some rules regarding air quality, but the Air Quality Control Commission is primarily responsible for developing Colorado's air pollution control policy, regulating sources of pollution, and conducting hearings involving violations of the state's air pollution control laws. So if you could please switch to the next slide. So this slide here just outlines very high level some of the rulemakings that COGCC has coming up. As you know, Senate Bill 181 required them to undertake a variety of different rulemakings. And the first one that they're going to start out with is the flow lines rulemaking. The Senate Bill 181 required COGCC to review and amend its flow line and inactive, temporarily abandoned, and shut-in well rules to the extent necessary to protect public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. And part of that mandate will require that the agency map flow lines and allow for public disclosure of that information. And tomorrow is actually one of their first stakeholder meetings, their first public stakeholder meeting on that process. And the very last bullet point on the slide there, that's, I think, a useful resource for folks in this room. They have a one-stop website for all of their Senate Bill 181 related materials. And on that website, they have a calendar that I've uploaded CDPHE's upcoming rulemakings and upcoming stakeholder meetings to. And they're in the process of updating all of uploading all of their meetings and hearing processes on there. So you all just have one place you have to go to see where the meetings are going to be occurring. Another rulemaking that they have to undertake, this is one of their big ones, it's their mission change rulemaking, requiring that all of their regulations are consistent with their new or their updated mission to prioritize the protection of public health, welfare, and the environment. In addition to those rulemakings, they have the cumulative impacts rulemaking, which Senate Bill 181 requires that COGCC, in consultation with CDPHE, develop a rule to address and to evaluate and address the cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. And that will be held in March of next year. And then also they are going to undertake a rulemaking concerning alternative site analyses. And that rulemaking requires them to adopt an alternative location analysis process and specify criteria used to identify oil and gas locations and facilities proposed to be located near populated areas that will be subject to the alternative location analysis process. So in addition to the calendar that they have on their website, I've been told that they've also opened up public comment portals, so you can all submit your comments through that website there.
Okay. So I think this is the last slide, and I just wanted to leave you then with just some important dates for the Air Quality Control Commission proceedings. So again, September 19th is when the Air Pollution Control Division is going to request that the commission set a rulemaking hearing in December of this year. October 17th is going to be the date when party status requests are due. So before that date, you would want to decide whether or not you'd like to request party status, and if so, if you work to form or join a coalition, if you think that's something that makes sense in your situation. If you are a party, then you'd want to note all of those deadlines of the status conference, pre-hearing conference, pre-hearing statements, and rebuttal. If you're not going to be a party to the hearing, please note those oral public comment dates, and hopefully you'll be able to attend one of those around the state. And November 26th would be the deadline for submitting written public comment, and December 17th to 19th is when the commission will hear oral testimony from parties to the hearing and then vote on the rule.
Can I provide some clarification?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. I just jotted down a few things that I wanted to clarify. First, Tricia mentioned some public comment periods that we're going to have in Rifle and in Durango and in Loveland on December 10th, December 11th, and December 16th, respectively. And I just wanted to clarify that those public comment sessions are all on the record, so on the administrative record for the rulemaking hearing and in front of the commissioners. So those will be in front of the actual decision makers in all of this. Whereas the public comment sessions that the Air Pollution Control Division is hosting right now is to solicit information so that they can bring forward the most comprehensive proposal to the Air Commission this month. On that line, the Air Pollution Control Division works as staff to the Air Quality Control Commission. So the Air Quality Control Commission creates the rules, and the Air Pollution Control Division implements those rules. So while they're closely related, they're not the same entity. I also want to mention there's a really simple handout that was up by the sign-in sheet. I think it has some good information on how to provide effective public comment, and I printed a bunch of copies, so if you guys would please take a few, I would appreciate it. Hand them out to your friends. I have more copies if we run out. And then one last clarification. So we were talking a little bit about time allocations that parties get at the hearing. So one of the things that comes with party status is you get more time than you would just as a public commenter in front of the commission to provide oral testimony. Those time allocations are given by the hearing officer. So with each rulemaking hearing, there's a hearing officer assigned to that hearing. So in this case, at the September request, we'll assign a hearing officer to this particular rulemaking, and that commissioner will make those decisions based on the content of your pre-hearing statements and your rebuttal statements and what you have to bring to the rulemaking itself. So if there's a lot of substance, a lot of information that needs to get out on the table, that's how time allocations are given to the various parties to any rulemaking. So just wanted to provide those clarifications. And with that, I think we'll move into questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Also, can I introduce you? So I want to introduce another person from our department who can help with answer any questions or maybe provide some comments. So it's John Putnam, our Director of Environmental Programs.
Thank you. I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. This is a little bit of an experiment for us, but it's really important to the state and to the Department of Public Health and Environment that people not have a chance just to show up, but to be as effective as they can be, and information is power. So we do hope that you'll ask us all the questions that you have on your mind, and we're trying to be more inclusive and provide more opportunities, not make everybody come to Cherry Creek all the time, not just have these during working hours. So look forward to your questions, and really appreciate your time tonight.
Yes, question. And if I can I ask you to come to the mic just because we are recording this? Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. A number of you who are in the crowd have participated in these hearings, and so if there's questions answered, or sorry, if there are questions posed and you've got an answer, please help us out and let folks know if you think there's a way to round out the conversation. And also, can I make one more comment before you go? It's just that, you know, maybe you don't have a question, maybe you have a comment or some feedback to us about frustration, that maybe you've tried to participate before and found some part of the process confusing or frustrating, and it would be great for us to hear that and know that. If you have suggestions for changes, we'd love to hear that also. So with that, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Is it on? You had mentioned that typically the APCD proposes a rule. Are they the only entity that's allowed to propose a rule? Can a citizen, or what is the process for that? Maybe you can talk about.
Sure. Yeah, great question. Can everybody hear it okay to come up on the mic? Okay. So no, the division, yes, a citizen is allowed to make a proposal. Anyone is allowed to make a proposal, not just the division. The one thing I would highlight would be the parts on this slide about what's required to propose a rule. So I think that was part of your question about what does that involve. So if you would like to propose a rule, then we would, first I'd like to say let's talk as soon as possible if you're thinking about that, because we would want to make sure that that's considered at that September 19th request for hearing. And you would want to include regulatory language as well as an initial economic impact analysis at that stage. And there are a couple of other elements in the Commission's procedural rules that would be part of that packet, and we could talk about that.
But,
yeah.
September 19th would be the only period we could do it in future.
Great question. Okay, so the question is that the only time, or could you do that at a future hearing? And yes, that's right. You could be a proponent in a future rulemaking hearing, yes.
And then also just wanted to highlight, I think there's, on the last slide, there's a link to some resources. Those are also on the handout that Jeremy mentioned. But one of those resources that might help answer those types of questions about how individuals can, submit a rulemaking packet, it's the Air Quality Control Commission's rulemaking process guidebook, and that has a really good summary of the Commission's procedural rules and a good, just about 1 page or so of the chronology of events to help people understand how that process goes.
live?
I think so.
Okay. If we've been granted party status with the COGCC, do we need to reapply for party status to you again?
Yes, that's a great question, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, two entirely separate proceedings, and actually, it highlights something. So, let's say you request party and are granted party status for the AQCC's December rulemaking hearing, and you participate in that, and then we have another hearing next year, even on Senate Bill 181. It's a whole separate process, and so you need to reapply again for that one as well. So, each hearing with each entity needs a separate request. Thanks. Yeah.
As a directly impacted citizen in Adams County, North, with all of the wells that are functioning, I have a question. From my knowledge, the wording of the SB 181, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is to prioritize health, safety, and the environment. And you did not use that term. You used the term, let's see. Well, you can tell me which one it was. Oh, protects as opposed to prioritize. So in other words, are citizens the priority, or is promoting oil and gas the way it was before? And so it said, now the essence of my real question after that is, when you said you're doing economic impact analysis and cost-benefit analysis of these activities, how are you including the public health effects in this calculation? I don't see anything about the health effects as far as costs of medical care and problems with health of people who are the concerned citizens. I'd like to know how that health is included in your economic impact analysis and quote cost-benefit analysis. How do people come in?
So thank you for your questions. Just with respect to the first part, I think I used both. I used the word prioritize. The actual statute itself says that they have to regulate the development and production of oil and gas in the state in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. And how I've interpreted that and how others have interpreted that is prioritizing the protection of public health and environment.
That's not what it says. That's not what it says.
What does it say, sir?
It says protects.
That's what so that's
not prioritizing, it's protecting.
and we've interpreted it to mean prioritizing protection of public health and environment. So did you want to address the question about?
Well, I think there's also two questions. One is the charge to the COGCC. The specific task that the legislature gave to the Air Quality Control Commission is to minimize emissions. And so that's the test that we're working under. That being said, the legislature still left in place provisions that require us to do those economic analyses and other pieces. And traditionally, as part of that, you can tally all the benefits and all of the costs associated with that. And to the extent that there is a health benefit from reducing emissions, which there is, we try to capture the benefits of that in economic terms as well as in human terms and in tonnage and all the other sort of pieces to the extent that we can in that information. And that is, a big part of what would happen in a rulemaking hearing like this, is to have the conversation, develop the information so that the commission will have the best information about all of those issues to render that decision, but with the understanding that the direction from the legislature is still to minimize emissions.
And one quick note on the cost-benefit analysis and the economic impact analysis. It has historically been very difficult to determine what the appropriate costs are for health effects of inaction. And there's a lot of new data and science coming out on that as we speak, because this is a big national issue, I think. You see it at the federal level, and you see it at the state level, and you see it at the local level. And one nice thing about this process is that at the request, there's an initial economic impact analysis that the Air Pollution Control Division will bring to the Air Quality Control Commission for consideration. And at that point in time, folks will have every opportunity to either provide written comment, oral public comment, or through the party process to criticize or support or provide input on that initial economic impact analysis, so that the final economic impact analysis that comes in front of the commission can be as comprehensive as possible. So there will be effectively roughly 2.5-month process that folks will have the ability to comment on that initial economic impact analysis. So if you think something's missing, then I strongly encourage everyone to provide that information through the pre-hearing process or at the hearing through oral comment in front of the commission.
Lois Vanderquay. Along the same line, I know there was a climate bill also passed, and will that be joined with your process somehow? And this cost-benefit analysis?
So as an overall piece, we're viewing the rulemaking under Senate Bill 181 as a first critical building block for how we're going to comply with House Bill 1261, which is the climate bill, or one of the two climate bills. And so it will be part of the consideration, and I think from our perspective, we know we need the emissions reductions from this sector if we're going to meet the targets the legislature set to reduce emissions by 26% in 2025, 50% in 2030, and then even higher levels out into the future. We can't get there without reducing it from every sector, and this is actually the first big piece that we'll tackle along with other pieces related to electricity generation, transportation, everything else. So it's critical. It will be part, again, I think going back to Jeremy's point about the cost benefit analysis, sometimes those numbers are hard to come by, and so we take a first good stab at it, but everybody should, certainly give us the best information they have on that front to continue that. Again, we view that as a non-negotiable imperative to reach those targets, and so we'll be looking at ways to do that. There'll be costs and benefits associated with it, but we have a mandate from the legislature.
Hi, Jan Rose. I have a request, if I can. This presentation is going out to everybody who signed in. Would you include a link or the text of Regs 3 and 7 so that we can take a look at the wording and the level of inclusion that currently exists before you do the redlining of the draft? That would be great.
Yeah.
Is that doable?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention the handouts that that Jeremy put, I think, on the table out there. They actually do have the websites, the links to. They don't.
They do, but I realize that it's a hyperlink. So, but we are going to send out the handout in electronic format so
Perfect.
that you'll have hyperlinks to the red line versions of the rules.
That'd be great.
that are out there.
And
I think she wants the current version.
And
Yeah,
I'll
the
send
current
out, I'll
yeah.
also include
Yeah,
a
'cause-
copy of the existing rules right now for Regs 3 and 7, and I'll actually point to the specific provisions because they're both lengthy rules that incorporate
Yeah.
a lot of non-oil and gas related.
yeah, and certainly a lesson that parties learned from the Series 500 rulemaking at the COGCC is when we see the redlined modifications, it's often too late for us to provide the meaningful input that we would like to plan for. So thank you for that. That will be very helpful. Secondly, I'm not sure if this is going to be addressed as a rule as part of the December rulemaking, but you are now taking over the pre-production phases of air pollution, and thank you so much for eliminating that 90-day loophole. But I wonder, have you already developed a process for the handover of responsibilities with a date certain and the staff, on the CDPHE side that will be picking up those responsibilities? And will you, in fact, staff the inspectors needed for the pre-production phase of air pollution particularly? Thank you.
Great question, and the answer is yes. As part of implementing every rule, one of the things that we will do internally is identify how that will change workflows, staffing, all of those other sort of things. We're not done with that process, but we've started talking about that process, and it will be a critical part of the process. Obviously, a regulation is only effective if you can actually implement it, and it's something that we know that we'll need to implement, along with new changes that will come with the change in status of our ozone non-attainment area, which will change the thresholds for major source status, for example. So a number of changes that are requiring us to take a look at how we staff, how we structure the process, for those, and that will require, thinking through, how many of the inspections are for pre-production versus regular production. We're already doing some of those inspections, but we'll continuously look at that, try to figure out the best way to get the most bang for the buck in terms of the resources that we have.
Yeah, sorry. Walked away from the mic. I think for those of us who are really concerned about the completions phase and that 90 days of extraordinary amounts of pollution, we'd really like to know, will that be eliminated in the December hearing, or is that a future rulemaking? And maybe the texts of Regs 3 and 7 will tell us a little bit about that. I don't know, but that's important to the environmental and the citizens that live really near fracking wells. Thanks.
If I might just, especially with Mr. Putman, continue the conversation about the differences between the two commissions' directives in 181. First, the science is showing that it's primarily benzene coming from the industry that's causing the increase in leukemia. I think that's pretty clear from Dr. McKenzie's work. Maybe you don't agree, but we certainly have the scientific information out there that shows increasing cancer for proximity to these facilities. And the likely inducement there is benzene and formaldehyde. So the question goes like this. 181 directs the Oil and Gas Commission to have their actions protect public health. Same time, 181 directs the Air Quality Control Commission to do better, to minimize. Will the rules that the Air Quality Control Commission adopt under 181 be subject to the obligation that they're sufficient to protect public health? Or will it be a much lower hurdle, only that the industry minimize?
That's a good question. So the way in which our regulations work and the statutory direction from the legislature is part of an overall direction to the Department of Public Health and Environment and the Air Quality Control Commission to promulgate regulations to protect public health. So everything we do is with the aim of protecting public health or the environment to the extent that they're separate. Either way, that's the direction that we have. And so the intent of doing all of these things is to protect public health, whether that be related to climate-related concerns, which have a strong and obvious connection to public health and environment, for ozone, and we know that there's a clear connection with ozone. And we do know that benzene and some of the members of that BTEX family of chemicals are human carcinogens, and that the lower that will be, the lower the effect on public health. The evidence, I think, is less clear from a pure epidemiological perspective of exactly what those effects are right now and the kind of at varying distances. From our perspective, our direction is clear. We're going to get those as low as we possibly can, kind of regardless of that point, and every reduction improves public health. And we know to meet just the ozone standards, we're going to have to considerably reduce those VOC emissions, which include benzene as one of the most potent of the precursors of ozone, as well as the methane that's driving climate change. So we view them as a package that together we know that these are harmful to public health and the environment, and we're going to do what we can to drive those down as low as we can get.
I think for some time it's been recognized in the non-attainment area here in the Front Range that one way to achieve attainment is to require offsetting emissions, where any new source must go out and provide an equal offset. Given how late that is in the process, first we got the Oil and Gas Commission doing cumulative impacts next fall, and I think the schedule was for the Oil and Air Quality Control Commission at the same time, but you didn't even have a date yet for serious non-attainment of ozone. If you stick to that schedule, when might be the first time that a permit issued by the commission would require an offset?
So some permits already require offsets to the extent that they're major sources. The threshold for major source will go down when EPA redesignates as serious, which we expect probably by the end of the year, could be early next year. That timing is up to them. Based on the rules that we have, that will be an automatic requirement. That will probably cause more offsets. What we have not done as a state before, and is pretty rare across the country, is to consider doing offsets for minor sources. Those that are currently below 100 tons per year or soon will be below 50 tons per year. That's one of the things that's on the table for consideration for the rulemaking that will likely start next year. Should that pass from the commission, and depending on the timing for implementation, that would probably be looking at 2021 to do that. I will say, having worked with those offset programs elsewhere in the country, it takes time to set them up to work well. I've worked on them in Southern California, for example, and they've taken years to set up properly. We want to make sure, if we're going to go down that path, which is definitely a tool on the table, that you've got to make sure you've got the infrastructure set up to make sure that the offsets are correct, that you can enforce things correctly. That takes some time, but it is something that we're taking a very hard look at right now.
Can you, on 181, can you give me the reasoning? Is there a primary reason to reduce emissions? I know we mentioned climate, we mentioned public health. Is one above the other? Is it just, are they equal?
It's a great question, and I encourage everybody to take a look at that language, because that's what's going to be driving the commission, and everybody should make their arguments to the commission based on that. The language says to minimize emissions of all the pollutants that come out, greenhouse gases, ozone forming, hydrocarbons, all the other sort of pieces. It doesn't by itself identify a priority among them, which tells me that the legislature views them all as important.
Well, what I'm about to tell you won't affect you. I know you're listening to the legislature, but I have heard some comments, and I feel it's important to say this from my point of view, and maybe some others. The parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere today is around 406. It's the average since mammals have been on this planet has been over 1,000. There's no evidence that CO2 emissions are the dominant factor to climate change. Since 2002 to 2015, studies in Weld County, and this is from the Executive Director and Chief Health Officer, as oil and natural gas production in Weld has increased by 12 times and 3 times respectively, and the well counts more than doubled, the rates of death for cancer, respiratory illness, and heart disease decreased by 1.9%, 9.1%, and 21.4% respectively. And from my point of view, the truth of the matter is the most effective way to reduce CO2 emissions right now is to actually replace coal with natural gas. So I just want to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think on those substance, certainly would encourage you to provide that information to the commission. Our direction from the legislature is to reduce those emissions. Certainly from the department's perspective, we continue to have a very serious ozone non-attainment issue, and oil and gas is one of the 2 largest sources of that. We can't meet those health-based standards without addressing emissions from the oil and gas industry as well as transportation. We've already significantly cleaned up the coal-based generation in the state, in part with gas, but we have a lot of place to go, and we have a lot of room to work under the new legislation related to climate. In order to do that, we're going to have significant reductions in emissions. So that's the task in front of us, the direction for the legislature, and certainly encourage you, as well as everybody in this room, to submit that information and evidence for the commission to consider.
Thank you for having a relatively broad audience today. I'm a scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and also an affiliate at CU Boulder. So we can talk about climate change and CO2 with the previous speaker. So I'm really excited that you are opening, the avenue for more people to bring meaningful comments and input. Something that I'd like to see the state of Colorado do more effectively is engage with the local scientific community. You have definitely some scientific experts, probably at COGCC for the underground part, and definitely for the air and the water at CDPHE. We have a huge atmospheric research community here within NOAA, CU Boulder, CSU, and School of Mines. And I think it would be really beneficial for us to understand how we can conduct research that informs the Commission ahead of time. So if we could lay out not just like short-term, preps for hearings, but also longer-term priorities in terms of what needs to be investigated and documented and researched. And one piece that I would like to contribute is going to have to do with greenhouse gases, the inventory, the reporting, how we evaluate the baseline inventory and then potential reductions over time. I think we have a unique opportunity with the amount of expertise we have to make huge progress. Now, a personal statement here. I used to live in Boulder County. I'm now in Jefferson County. So I moved away from oil and gas operations, but I now live where we have the worst ozone, in the foothills. And I think definitely that it's not just oil and gas, transportation has a huge role. I've been working on oil and gas emissions for as long as my daughter has lived, and I have seen definitely progress. The rules are working. They are not enough though. And the ozone problem is not gone. So I hope that by the time she's an adult and she moves on, we have gone out of this non-attainment. We owe that to our community, we owe that to our children to really work together to make a huge difference. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to piggyback a little on what she said regarding vehicle emissions. I know that you've been commissioned to minimize emissions. I've heard that quote several times. And what exactly does that mean? Emissions from vehicles, which is one of the primary contributors to pollution. But do you consider, and how do you consider other contributors to pollution? And where do you draw the line before completely eliminating an industry? Where is that line drawn? Because I know a lot of people here would like to eliminate the industry, but how far does that go, the minimize emissions?
So let me address both of those issues. The first is related to vehicles, and we have traditionally looked at that. Colorado's been a leader for decades now in reducing and working with the federal government, reducing vehicle emissions. So, vehicles now are, at least for gasoline-powered vehicles, anywhere between 98, 99% cleaner per vehicle than they were. Of course, we also have vastly more vehicles on the road driving more miles, so we've lost a lot of that progress. And one of the tasks in front of us is try to figure out how to get that next round of reductions. It's hard with motor vehicles because the federal government has reserved a lot of the power for itself, and we have a more limited role. So the tools in our toolbox are less extensive than we do for example, the oil and gas industry. I think with regard to the question about how far we go with this minimization language from Senate Bill 181, that's what this rulemaking is designed to address, and we'll be having that conversation in the future. The legislature did not say to put an industry out of business. It said to minimize emissions. I believe that the technology, the business practices, everything else are out there to allow basically pretty close to zero emissions from this industry in terms of the extraction, development, other parts of that process. Those emissions are going down over time. There are still a lot of things that we can do to reduce those emissions. We're going to pursue those pieces of emissions. We believe that can occur. I think a longer-term question will be, as we look at our climate-related objectives, how do we deal with the use of fossil fuels? If we're going to meet our objectives, we need to burn fewer fossil fuels and replace those with the alternatives. That won't happen overnight, but I think that's a place where the legislature has directed that we're going to need to move over time to meet the pressing climate-related challenges we have.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. I guess I just want you to know and the COGCC to know, and I do also value health, safety, and well-being, and I think that includes keeping my children warm in the winter and being able to drive a vehicle to take them to school and things like that. So just keep that in mind. Don't eliminate completely.
I've commented before on what I thought happened with this legislation when it was in the legislature, and that the issue of economic efficiency, benefit cost ratios was hotly debated, and it lost. There is no economic analysis required. Your requirement is to protect public health and safety on all oil and gas issues, and that applies to you, to me, and everybody else in the state. They didn't carve out an exception on oil and gas. The rule is to protect public health and safety. So you may have a set of regulations that deal with automobile pollution, industrial pollution, and you may be able to apply the economic efficiency principle there. But I don't think you can do that on oil and gas, because that argument was lost in the state legislature. I was there every time. I know what happened. I do have another comment, and that is on the issue of protecting public health. If I heard you right, what you said was that air quality emissions would not be measured until after an oil development goes into production. That is not what this law requires. This law requires that you start measuring when those people put the first drill in the ground. And you have to measure and protect the public from that point on. Now, I hope that is what you're planning on doing in this rulemaking, because I've heard twice now that that is not what you're going to do, and it alarms me quite a bit.
Well, thank you for that question and opportunity to clarify. I think, as a bunch of folks up here have mentioned, we're planning to address it from the pre-production phase all the way through the life cycle of the well, and if there are emissions, then we view the task of Senate Bill 181 to look at those emissions and address those emissions. So, we're not limiting it to just production phase, and indeed explicitly, our rules already address pre-production phase, and will continue, and we're going to tighten those. So that's our task, and we need to do that to meet all the public health objectives. On the question related to economic impacts, those we can address during the substance of the hearing. I will say, the law amended a part of our existing air quality statute. It did not take out the provisions that we go through these economic analyses, these cost-benefit analyses. And so those provisions are still in place, along with the direction to minimize emissions. And one of the tasks in front of the commission will be to how to harmonize those provisions. That will be one of the tasks in front of us. There was nothing about the language that explicitly removed those charges to the commission, and those will be issues that we will need to work out. That being said, we also know that there are a lot of very cost-effective emission reduction measures, and we can greatly reduce emissions and have them be cost-effective at the same time, and that will be what will be in front of the commission to decide.
Okay, so let's take a real-life situation. If the principle is protect the public health and safety, you can minimize in a certain individual situation, but it may not be protective of public health and safety in the individual case. On a macro basis, it might be. Can you foresee a situation under what you're envisioning, which I think is wrong actually, but that you would say you can't drill because you can't protect public health and safety? We don't care what kind of economic analysis it's put under. even minimizing. Can you see a situation like that developing? Because I can, quite simply. Can you see that happening?
I'm not sure what that hypothetical looks like, and what we're charged with is taking a look at the evidence in front of the commission. We don't have that yet. That's going to be part of this process, as well as the at least 3 other additional rulemakings that we'll have behind this. Our task is to, reduce emissions, keep working at doing that to minimize those emissions from the source. That's the charge from the legislature. That's what we're going to do. Where that leads in terms of possible hypotheticals in the future, I can't answer from here right now. We'll get there if we ever get there. In the meantime, there are a lot of things that we can do.
Hi. I have a question about the impacts on the respiratory issues that are currently happening. So I'm fortunate to be part of Boulder Valley School District. And when I call one of my children out of school, there's now a prompt that says that they're doing some research. And you press 1 for asthma, press 2 for respiratory-related illnesses, press 3 for another aspect, and that they're collecting data. Are there other school systems and other Front Range areas that are collecting data? And would that be referred to your department? Because they're respiratory, that would be air quality and Department of Health and Safety, since you guys work together. And can we, how is this going to be used? Is it going to be used, and when? Because I have to hear this just to answer somebody's phone call, and I'm just wondering what's happening, and is there anything that we're doing cumulatively on the impact of all of our children?
Another great question. So I know there are ongoing studies. Some of them we're involved with, some of them are being done from academic institutions. National Jewish down in Denver has a number of studies. Often they have crossovers. I think CU, Department of Public Health, and the hospital there have been doing studies. Our team of epidemiologists and toxicologists are often involved and consulted with them. Collectively, we use that information to inform, the approach that we take on all of the issues that we have related to air pollution, water pollution, all those pieces. I don't know specifically about the Boulder study.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what the status with other studies are, but those studies do come to our department. We use those to help inform our policy. They also will help inform the policy. EPA sets the standards, what's the right level for ozone or particulate matter. Those are critical for helping set those new standards. The next round of consideration of whether those standards will be lowered is just about to start. So a lot of that information will come in. It takes time to develop some of that critical science. In the meantime, our focus is trying to reduce emissions to hit the targets that are out there, reduce emissions from this sector, from transportation, from stationary sources, the power plants and refineries, all those other sort of pieces, try to get there. In the meantime, we obviously have all the monitors and put out the information about the ozone alerts. We'd like to issue no alerts if we can, and that's really our objective.
So are the current emissions that you're trying to achieve part of today's air quality standards, or are we still trying to get to 2013 and we're just collecting data of kind of what's happened in the meantime? Are we just trying to get to the attainment from 2013, or are we trying to get to like climate crisis, like in moving forward and what the new rules are, and with SB 181 and what your new role is, and with this new government?
All of the above.
Okay, thank you.
Hi again. I guess my question relates to, we're hearing things like oil and gas, we know, are emitting benzene, which is a carcinogen, leukemia near these sites, ozone, which is a known health hazard. I've heard you, Mr. Putnam, say at least 4 times that the directive or the your mission is to reduce emissions, but it's not. The law says minimize. And the plain meaning, definition of minimize is to reduce something to the least possible level or amount. I guess I'm getting to my question. First is to recognize that it's not to reduce, it's to minimize. We have known health hazards. We have this industry that's killing people, that's sending children to hospitals, that's sending someone in my own family to hospital for respiratory issues. We're living this, and then we hear, the industry people come up here. The majority of people who come to these hearings to speak in favor of public health are citizens who are not getting paid for this. Probably 100% of the people from industry who come to these are getting paid for it. So my question, I'm finally getting there, is would you consider weighting these comments? For every issue, get someone from the scientific community who will counter someone from the industry or just, provide the science. And then separately from citizens, and just a recognition that, and we know you're under immense pressure from industry, and we know the dollars that are getting paid to fight what's, the right thing to do here. But is there a way that you can just, weight the input and, hear, oh, you're going to kill an industry. What about the people that are getting killed from what's going on from this industry? So anyway, thank you.
I think that's a great point to talk about process, which is what today was really for. Throughout the party process, it's very common for us to have environmental groups, some well-known environmental groups that are often involved in our hearing processes. It's also common for the Air Pollution Control Division to hire scientific experts to come in and testify on behalf of a proposal or in a counter argument to a proposal. So that's really what the whole process is for parties to come together, bring their information that they have that might support their interests to the commission for consideration. And again, I want to emphasize that in this hearing, there will be parties that are environmental groups that are quite familiar with our process and quite familiar with our regulations and the requirements on the oil and gas industry. And so again, that's what the party process is for, is to bring all that information, whether it's from the scientific community, from an economist or whomever, to the commission for consideration so that the commission can make the best decision possible with the most information and best information possible.
I'll add a couple quick things on that. I think the first is I work for the Department of Public Health and Environment. The legislature has entrusted the ultimate decision on those rules to the commission, and that commission is appointed by the governor. We don't control the commissioners, and so it's up to them to weigh that evidence. That being said, I think it's important to know that this commission has exceptionally well accomplished experts, respiratory scientists who work at National Jewish, air quality experts from CU. The caliber of that group is exceptionally high. They ask very probing, very technical questions of all of the parties, and I think they suss out, where the best science lies based on health and the environment and technical issues that are there, as well as listening to the kind of real impacts that happen in the community. And that's the way the process is supposed to work here. We need to hear all voices, they need to hear all voices, and then weight those based on the kind of power of the arguments, the power of the facts that come through. We would worry about setting barriers that would keep some people from having a voice at this stage, because we know that politics change and there could be a different governor, a different set of parties in power, and I think there will be dangers and limits on who could present information. What we want are the best people up there hearing the best information from the most people so that we can really suss out, that truth. There is a lot of very powerful factual information that's out there right now, and we've heard about, the range of experts here in Colorado on atmospheric issues. This is one of the kind of hot spots in the country for expertise that's reflected both on the commission and then the information that the commission gets. So we'll encourage everyone to be there, and there will be a wide variety of voices. We need to hear them.
Hi, good evening. I have a quick comment and then also just follow up with a question. Quickly, the comment is I appreciate you talking about how you interpret Senate Bill 181 as prioritizing health and safety, and also that all the pollutants that are being regulated by AQCC are to be treated the same and minimized. I can tell you, as one of the authors of the bill, I know that was the intent of the bill, so I appreciate that you're taking that intent out of it. The quick question is, you mentioned that there's 2 phases to the Senate Bill 181 rulemakings. One is going to happen in November or throughout the fall, and it listed some of the topics that you'll be covering. The second part is anticipated to happen next fall of 2020, but it just was kind of a TBD. It didn't list the types of topics you're thinking about covering in phase 2. I was wondering if you had that information. If not, that's fine, but I just wondered if you had it at this point.
I don't have a definitive list, but I can share with you, if I can find it here on my notes. I know that there has been some things that have been tagged to be discussed in those future hearings. So. A couple of things that we've been talking about would be looking at continuous methane emissions monitoring, especially for large emitting facilities, multi-well facilities, and facilities in close proximity to occupied structures. Potentially a minor source offset program. Potentially some more control requirements that would be based on proximity to homes or businesses. Enhanced well unloading requirements, maybe looking at alternative LDOT requirements as well.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I have 2 parts. The first part is there's a lot of talk about benzene tonight and whether or not that's going to be measured, regulated, monitored, that kind of thing. And I just wanted to impart to you a story of one of my coworkers. They lived in Firestone and had a fracking site come in across the street from their house. She came to work with me every day. Her husband had a martial arts studio. And he was at home all day long, and around 3 or 4 o'clock, he headed to the martial arts studio and then was there till 10 o'clock. She was at work with me, so she left probably around 7:30 in the morning. 8 to 5 was with me, and then went to the martial arts studio. After about 5 months, he started having low-grade fevers. But he was a young man, he was healthy, he was 29, he was a martial arts instructor, so he ate healthy, worked out regularly, didn't go to the doctor. After 3 months of having low-grade fevers, he called her at work and said, "You need to come home and take me to the hospital." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "I can't even move to get out of bed." So they took him to a hospital here in Boulder County, and they told her, it was New Year's Eve, they said, he may not make it through the night. He has leukemia so terribly that we're moving him right now to the cancer ward, and you need to prepare yourself. And he went through chemo treatments. The good news is he's alive today. Of course, he suffers from a lot of the side effects that come with chemotherapy and radiation treatment. They didn't have children before this. Of course, now they don't know that they can, and he probably can't. And they did all sorts of testing on him to find out what was the source of his leukemia. And they said it was benzene exposure. Now, I don't know about you, but when you have a family member that's ill, the worst word you can hear in the world is cancer, right? And I have a best friend whose daughter went through it, and it's tore their family apart. As the Colorado Department of Public Health, I don't think there should be any question then you should be monitoring that, measuring those levels, and doing something about those for people. So that's my first comment. My second one is 257102 says, in order to foster the health, welfare, convenience, and comfort of the inhabitants of the state of Colorado, and to facilitate the enjoyment and use of the scenic and natural resources of the state, is declared to be the policy of this state to achieve the maximum practical degree of air purity in every portion of the state, to attain and maintain the national ambient air quality standards, and to prevent the significant deterioration of air quality in those portions of the state where the air quality is better than the national ambient air quality standards. You may have read this, since this is what's, your charter. So we're a non-attainment area. We're about to go to Sirius. So these aren't being followed, right? We're not keeping up our air quality standards. Mathematically, you can figure out what it takes to become an attainment area. And not just that, for our carbon reduction goals, if you look at all the states across the country that are doing something about carbon reduction goals, you can't meet any carbon reduction goals, or the aggressive ones that you have, without doing something in every single area of the state. You've already mentioned coal and transportation, so obviously we need to do something here. When you consider rules to implement to reduce these emissions and things like that, is there going to be a calculation, a mathematical calculation on how this will help us get us to an attainment area? And do you have a date of when we can? Because that's what we all want, right? We all want clean air. So are you going to be doing the mathematical calculations to say, if we minimize to this level, it's going to get us here in this amount of time? Or do we need to do more?
Sure. So thank you for reading that statute. I think it's good for everybody to hear. That is our charge. That's the duty of our department. So we take that very seriously. I personally take that very seriously. So specifically on the question of how you achieve the emissions reductions to get to the ozone standards, the answer is yes. We're in the process of modeling that right now. It's a long and expensive process. We have to try to capture all of the emissions from all the sources, both in our metro area as well as the air coming in from outside of it, run that through a complicated model, and then run different scenarios of saying, okay, well, if we did nothing, what would we be? If we reduce this, if we reduce that, what would it take to get us there? We're going through that process right now. We may not have all of that information ahead of completing this rulemaking. So we're going to try to get as much of that emission reduction and minimization as we can now, but know that we're going to have to come back and reduce it farther when we have the results of that information. Depending on when EPA sets that downgrade to the Sirius status, that will then set up an obligation for us to submit what's called an attainment state implementation plan to EPA that would have just that sort of mathematical analysis. And we're working through that now. We're collecting the information on those inventories, trying to predict how that will change with population growth, with all the different regulations that are being put in place, and make the best assessment that we can for doing that. And if we miss it, we come back and try it again.
Okay, thank you.
I think we do have time for one more question.
I'll make this quick because I know we're getting short on time. Two things. One, will you be looking at, as rulemaking requests come in, will you be looking at just the information provided with the rulemaking requests, or are you going to look for other sources of data? I know we just had a health or a air quality study done here in Broomfield for the activities happening in Broomfield. Would encourage you to take a look at that and say that be open to those sources as well, because data is key to this. And I think that's something that I would want to, impress on you. The second thing is, when you are setting rules, those types of things, is it practical in terms of looking at minimizing those effects, looking at what's practical, what's technically plausible and capable of happening from a industry perspective or even from a technology perspective? Are those going to be part of the rules that are going to be set? Is that going to be something that you do talk with industry experts and technology experts as to what can or cannot be done? Is that going to be part of what's factored in?
So in regards to the first part of your question, which was, I'm sorry, I just lost it, about additional data, yeah. So the commission is able to consider everything, must consider everything that's submitted on the record, but they're not supposed to be going out and doing separate research. And the idea is so that all 9 of them are considering the same information. So they will be considering more information than just what's in the request for rulemaking hearing, because they'll be considering everything that's submitted with all the pre-hearing statements and all the public comment. I would assume someone will submit that onto the record, and then it will be taken into consideration.
And I'll just add on to that, aside from what happens within this rulemaking, the Air Pollution Control Division, Sean, our epidemiologists and toxicologists, look at all of the studies that come out. Generally, the authors will consult with us as the public health agency and environmental agency. We work with Broomfield. We work with Boulder County, the universities on a lot of this research, and we comment on each other's research. We identify opportunities for further research. A lot of that information comes through the Air Pollution Control Division, which then informs their engagement in this process, and they can bring information into the commission's attention in that way, even if another party doesn't, if they think that it's there. So, we try to keep on top of those. We have monitoring resources, which we've deployed in Broomfield to try to collect localized information. We have toxicologists who help interpret that. We try to collect all of that. Is it enough? Probably not. Do we always want more data? You betcha. Are we trying to get more? Absolutely. And one of the things that we'll work with Broomfield and other communities is try to coordinate on the collection of that data, make sure we're all kind of on the same page in terms of the quality of that data and comparable methodologies, that sort of thing, so that we can make the best, most data-driven decisions that we can.
And as far as technology, practicality, as far as some of the rulemaking, how does that factor in?
So those are considerations that are part of the underlying air quality statutes. They're part of every conversation in front of the commission. What will be the commission's task is to decide how to weight that in light of the new language from 181, which has a direct charge to minimize emissions. And we believe that you can minimize emissions within current technology and economics, but that will be the chief charge in front of the commission.
Okay, yeah,
I'll be fast.
No problem.
We have some residents that live 1,300 feet from a 16-well pad that's being drilled right now, and they are suffering from congestion and eye irritation, and they did contact the city, and the city contacted the CDPHE, and you came out, and the camel was there, and it measured, and it said that the emissions were above the baseline but below the guidelines. And yet they're still suffering from these symptoms of the emissions. And so the question is, are the guidelines going to be reduced so that the emissions are reduced and brought down so that they're not suffering in their home, which is what's happening right now with some of our residents. And that's a real concern of ours. So looking at this rulemaking, and thinking about our ozone non-attainment and everything else that's happening here in the state with air quality, specifically what's going to happen in rulemaking to make this better?
So the first piece, I just wanted to respond to the health guideline values. So first of all, the monitoring data did show increase from the baseline, so that's the level before construction began. But that's, like you mentioned, different than the health guideline values. Those aren't set by Colorado. We don't have our own health guideline values. Those are set by other state and federal agencies. For example, the Center for Disease Control has an Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and they're the entity that's responsible for setting those. We just kind of use those as a reference level for comparing our air quality monitoring data to. So we don't, unfortunately, have any authority to establish those health guideline values?
I have a very direct question that I'm just asking for a statistic for my EPA testimony on Friday. I had contacted your organization and spoke to one of the environmental people. I have not gotten the answer back that I need. How many days in this current year, or in the summer, however you have the stats, have been ozone alert days or air quality alert days? I tried to look on your site. It was not easy for me. So I'd like to know, this is the worst year I've ever had. I have reactive asthma, and literally it's a life and death issue that I don't see that I know you're trying to take it seriously, but it's not being considered for us today, the people who are suffering every day and having to go to specialists in hospitals. So I'd like to know how many days this year has the Denver area been under the air quality, whatever you call it, ozone alert days?
So we're running out of time, and I'd like to just offer to speak with you outside so that we can let Broomfield close this up. But quickly, just a clarification on ozone alert days. We have a meteorology group that predicts whether they believe that ozone concentrations are going to be above the current National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So that's 70 parts per billion under the 2015 standard. And if the prediction it's based on weather and our current inventory of emission sources. So if they believe that the weather, because we need sun energy to create ozone, if they believe that that is going to be conducive for ozone formation, they'll issue an alert. The hope for that is that people will alter their behaviors, and whether that means you run on the treadmill indoors or if that means you carpool to work so that you can contribute and help reduce ozone formation, that's the purpose of those alerts. It's very often that we issue an alert and there actually is not an exceedance of the standard. For the overwhelming majority of the alert days this year, we actually did not exceed the standard. And there actually have been a couple of recent articles lately that discuss the number of ozone alert days that were this year, and it's actually significantly fewer this year than last year. So that's good news because it's good for everybody's health. But we can get you numbers on the number of alert days. We don't put that publicly available on the website because it's a predicted value and it doesn't always indicate whether or not there actually was an exceedance of a standard on that given day. So I hope that helps, and we can talk more after this. So.
And I'll just offer briefly as well, the actual values of measured ozone at the number of monitors that we have were lower this year than last year, but they're still over the standards. And so that's our task, is to get those below the standards to meet those standards every summer consistently. And so we still have work to do. Even though I think we're making progress, we know we need to make that progress faster.
Okay, so thank you all again very much. I'll just reiterate that if you signed in and provided your email address, we'll share with you the slides from tonight. We'll post a video of tonight on our website also that you can share with others. We've got resources, our phone numbers and email addresses are there, so if you've got additional questions, either now or as you're navigating through the process, please feel free to reach out to us. So thank you again very much for being here tonight.